Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IISS, and thank you for joining us today. I am Flore Berger, an assistant research analyst here at IISS. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our monthly conflict briefing. Today we focus on Myanmar and ask Aaron Connolly and Michael Hart to help us make sense of the conflict dynamics. Aaron, on my left, is a research fellow leading a new program in Southeast Asian political change and foreign policy at IISS, and is based in our Singapore office. Prior to joining IISS, Aaron was the director of the Southeast Asia project at the Lowy Institute in Sydney, and before that worked for various organizations, including the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Michael Hart, on my right, is a research analyst covering civil conflict, terrorism, and war legacy issues in Southeast Asia. Within IISS Conflict, Security and Development Program, he monitors and analyzes conflict trends in Myanmar and in the Philippines. He has previously researched for the London-based charity Action on Armed Violence and has contributed to regional publications including The Diplomat, Asia Sentinel, and the Japan Times. Aaron, if we can start with you. So, since September 2017, 700,000 Rohingya have fled persecution in Rakhine State in Myanmar. While many are now in camps in Bangladesh, about 500,000 are still in Myanmar. Can you tell us a bit about the humanitarian situation for the Rohingya, both in Bangladesh and in Rakhine State?
Sure. So the humanitarian situation is not good. It's more stable than I think any of us would have expected in 2017 when the outflow of Rohingya toward Bangladesh began. But as we've seen this year with Cyclone Bulbul, there's a number of risks, both natural risks and man-made risks. And the situation in the camps, although stable, there was a lot of money that was spent early on in 2017 to try to mediate risks from flooding, from landslides, public health risks. Those risks still remain. They've been mitigated, but they can't be eliminated. And so the 700,000 or so that are in camps or living in undeclared camps or in the community in Bangladesh remain at risk of infectious diseases, floods, landslides, things like that. And in July, there were 2 Rohingya who were killed in the flooding that occurred then, and about 5,000 who had to be relocated. And then in Rakhine State, things are worse. In 2018, around 1,300 Rohingya continued to flee Rakhine State for Bangladesh every month. Just recently, there's a boat of Rohingya that left central Rakhine State, Sitwe, for Yangon, and then sought to travel overland through Thailand to Malaysia. And as the rainy season ends, we can probably expect more of that activity. We haven't seen the massive outflow of Rohingya via boats that we saw in 2015. Thailand was very successful in shutting down a lot of the smuggling networks. But where there are push factors, you'll continue to see people try to flee, and we do continue to see that. The UN Special Rapporteur has recorded a number of these incidents in Rakhine State where Rohingya are confined to their villages. Even if they need emergency medical care, they need permission from local administrators to be able to travel to get that medical care. When they try to travel without permission, they're subject to violence from Rakhine vigilantes, which can be a problem, and also from the authorities, and there's very little accountability for that violence in Rakhine State. So the humanitarian situation is not good. It's better than where we thought it would be in 2017, but it's not good. Okay.
And if we continue a bit on that subject, the Myanmar government agreed to return and facilitate the return of Rohingya, including with the bilateral agreement with Bangladesh. This was supposed to take place 2 years ago, but still hasn't been implemented yet. So what are the long-term prospects for return of Rohingya in Myanmar?
I think not good. The long-term prospects for return are not good. And we should be honest about that. And I think one of the challenges so far has been that a number of key players in Southeast Asia have not been honest about that. Myanmar says that it wants to welcome the Rohingya back to Myanmar, to Rakhine State, but its actions on the ground tell another story. So the construction of military posts on top of Rohingya villages that were destroyed in the violence in 2017, the lack of accountability for vigilante violence against Rohingya, and a number of other actions that they've taken on the ground, the waffling that we see Myanmar officials do when they talk about how long Rohingya will have to spend in repatriation centers and whether or not they will ultimately be allowed to return to their place of origin and what that will actually look like. Rohingya are able to see through that sort of dissembling, and they understand that if they're to return to Rakhine State, it will be a very different experience than the one that they left. And then, of course, we can talk about this later, there's the matter of the conflict between the Tatmadaw and the Arakan Army. So the prospects for return are not good, and I think the international community now has some decisions to make, given the fact that repatriation is unlikely to occur in the next several years.
Thank you. If we go back a bit to where it all started, so the Aung San Suu Kyi government always argued that the crisis began because the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army attacked their military post, and then the military overreacted to this. Is that a fair characterization of how it began? And also, can you tell us a bit more about ARSA and how it has fared over the past 2 years?
So maybe I can take the first question first about ARSA. I think, if you go back to 2016 with the first ARSA attacks when it was still Harak al-Yaqin, and then 2017 with the much larger scale ARSA attacks, this is an incredibly poorly armed group compared to every other armed group in Myanmar, and there are about 22, Michael? What's the...
I think 21, 22
that actually have weapons.
In the conflict.
Yeah. So most of these attacks were mass people attacks on facilities using large sticks. In some cases, there were weapons, rifles, that had been stolen from Burma border guard posts in 2016. But for the most part, they were very poorly armed. And there wasn't actually large-scale support for ARSA in Rakhine State at the time. There was intimidation. And so ARSA had committed a number of assassinations of village Mazis who had opposed them. And there was conscription, effectively, of young Rohingya men. But there wasn't the kind of large-scale support that we see in other conflicts in Myanmar. That has begun to change. And the longer that the Rohingya are in Bangladesh, and really in a captive situation in the camps, the stronger ARSA has become. And so we've seen in a number of camps over the past 6 months or so, really, ARSA exercise more control, more authority. It's ad hoc, it's not complete, and there are a number of other actors in the camps who also are able to claim legitimacy and political authority, but there's no question that they're stronger than they were before. And I think the longer this goes on, the likelihood is that they will continue to get stronger. The Aung San Suu Kyi government's characterization of what happened in 2017 is not quite accurate. Of course, there was an ARSA attack, and it's worth remembering that, especially in conversations with Myanmar interlocutors. But the military preparation for the operations that occurred after August 25th were in place about 2 to 3 weeks beforehand. So the Tatmadaw was massing light infantry divisions in Rakhine State starting in late July, and had probably completed that process by August 25th. So they were expecting an attack, and they were prepared to launch what they call clearance operations, what the UN fact-finding mission says is probably a genocide, earlier than the attacks actually occurred. So, the Myanmar government's likely to continue to use these lines in its overseas rhetoric, but they lack truth and they're unable to substantiate those claims.
Thank you. Now, Michael, if we go back to you. So there's another conflict in Rakhine State that we hear less of, and despite being the more violent of the two at the moment, and that's the fighting between the Myanmar armed forces and the Arakan army. Can you tell us a bit about the sources of that conflict and how it plays also with the Rohingya crisis that Aaron talked about?
Yeah, so the conflict with the Arakan army is occurring in similar areas of Rakhine State to where the crackdown against the Rohingya took place on a large scale in 2017. However, the Arakan army also operates slightly further north in southern Chin State, particularly around Paletwa Township, and also to the south, further south in Rakhine also. So if I put the graphic on, which should hopefully come up behind, you can see the area where the clashes have taken place, which was sparked at the beginning of January this year by a series of attacks by the Arakan Army, which instead of being a majority Muslim group, its support doesn't come from the Rohingya. It's a majority Buddhist Arakanese group, which is another major ethnic group in Rakhine State, which effectively the Arakan Army would claim legitimacy to want to rule that region and run it as some kind of self-administered zone, which other armed groups run in the far east of Myanmar in Shan State, such as the United Wa State Army and the Kachin Independence Army, which is very, very influential further north. So the roots of the Arakan Army, despite its area of operations presently, was actually in the northwest in Kachin State. So it first emerged around 7 or 8 years ago. It had very close links in its early years with the Kachin Independence Army, which is one of the strongest groups in Myanmar. So the KIA has around 10,000 fighters, and the Arakan Army trained alongside the KIA and also drew support from the United Wa State Army, which is the most powerful armed group in Myanmar, has around 30,000 members, but has been largely peaceful since signing a ceasefire with the government in 1989. So whereas the Arakan Army has its origins in the northeast, its plan has always been to transition its fighters westward to Rakhine once it has built up enough strength and fighting experience, and also it made use of weaponry supplied by the KIA and the United Wa State Army. So what we've seen this year is in January, after an uptick in activity in Rakhine by the Arakan Army last year, on the 4th of January, Arakan Army fighters launched a wave of attacks against police outposts along the border with Bangladesh in Buthodong Township, which again is a similar region to where the crackdown against the Rohingya took place. So it's been quite complicated on the ground, and the events have been quite fast-moving in recent years, with first the crackdown on the Rohingya and the exodus to Bangladesh dominating the situation, whereas this year, since the attacks by the Arakan Army in January, we've seen a crackdown by the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar Armed Forces, predominantly targeting the Arakan Army rebels. So clashes have been ongoing and have spread across the townships in northern Rakhine and Paletwa Township in southern Chin State. And the clashes have really occurred on a daily basis, or a weekly basis at the very least, even in periods of less intense violence since January. So the fighting has mostly taken the form of Arakan Army ambushes against the Tatmadaw and the border police, using firearms, IEDs, and other light weaponry. So it's really been the, as you can perhaps see from the heat map, which represents clashes between January and September. In Rakhine State, most of the red colour you see represents the Arakan Army against the military clashes this year.
Now if we look a bit forward, so the government's signature policy to address internal conflict is centered on a nationwide ceasefire agreement.
Sorry.
You're right.
It's okay. Only a minor spillage. It'll be okay.
Just give you a bit of this.
Cheers, thank you.
Yes, so the nationwide ceasefire agreement, and it has been signed by 10 non-state armed groups since 2015.
Yeah.
Yet it has failed to stem violence in border areas, and during the past year talks have stalled. So what are the reasons for the failure, and do you think it can somehow be revived?
Yeah, so the nationwide ceasefire agreement, as Flo mentioned there, is the government's main peace initiative. So it was actually started before the election of Aung San Suu Kyi in October 2015. Several years previously, the military government, for the first time in Myanmar's history, tried to begin negotiations for a single ceasefire involving many of the armed groups. Before, negotiations had taken place over the years on a bilateral basis between the government and armed groups individually. And in some cases those were successful and managed to stem fighting, and it effectively lent the armed groups which signed those agreements, such as the UWSA, which I mentioned earlier, de facto control over their areas of influence in Shan State. And there's several other armed groups, including the National Democratic Alliance Army, which also run their own self-administered zone in that region along the border with China. So the nationwide ceasefire agreement, after several years of talks, a couple of weeks before the 2015 election, the agreement was signed initially between the government and 8 non-state ethnic armed groups. The problem with this is that the 8 groups that signed are some of the smallest and weakest groups in Myanmar, which are quite minor players in a conflict compared to the ones that are still active, or compared to the groups that run their own self-administered zones in Shan State. Another 2 groups signed the NCA in February 2018, which at the time was kind of billed as evidence of the success of the government strategy, which was to increase the number of groups that had signed the NCA over time. However, no more groups have signed in the past almost 2 years, and negotiations have really stalled in terms of the NCA. It's kind of reached an impasse. So you can see on the graphic there's many groups which have not signed, and many of these are some of the strongest and most well-equipped groups in Myanmar, including the Northern Alliance, which is a coalition between the Arakan Army, which has been the main group involved in clashes in Rakhine, also the Tang National Liberation Army, which is active in Shan State and has fought the government on a regular basis in the last 2 months after a flare-up of fighting in August. The Kachin Independence Army, which has been relatively inactive this year, but again is another very powerful, well-equipped group, is also a member of the Northern Alliance and hasn't signed. And the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army is the 4th member. So these 4 groups not being a part of the NCA and showing a reluctance to sign, and also the government has excluded them on many occasions in the past from the negotiations, even though now there are signs that perhaps it is looking to talk to them on a bilateral basis first, in the hope that they can bring the Northern Alliance on board in the coming years. The fact that they're not part of the NCA is a huge problem for the agreement. I mean, it's called the Nationwide Ceasefire Agreement, but it's really nationwide in name only, in the sense that it doesn't cover the groups in Myanmar's most active conflict areas. So most of the groups which are signatories are based in the southern conflict zones along the border with Thailand, where violence has been at a low level for many years. And it has been effective to a degree, in the sense that violence has not rebounded in those areas. The only kind of clashes we see along the border with Thailand are minor skirmishes between the armed groups themselves, and sometimes between the armed groups and drug trafficking gangs. There's been no large-scale conflict in the south between the Myanmar armed forces and the NCA signatories. So I think we do need to give it a degree of credit, in the sense that between the parties that have signed, violence has not rebounded. However, with talks now at an impasse, there has been no major peace conference held since the middle of 2018. And when Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD, National League for Democracy, first came to power, they pledged to hold one of their signature Panglong peace conferences every 6 months. So in the past 4 years, there's only been 3 of those conferences held. There have been some informal discussions between the government and the NCA signatories in the past couple of months about the potential of holding the 4th Panglong Conference in early 2020. If it was held, it would signal to a degree that the peace process is getting back on track with the existing signatories. But still, while those more powerful groups, especially the members of the Northern Alliance, remain outside of the NCA, it's going to have very little impact on reducing conflict in the real hotspots in Myanmar.
I might just add, I think that the UWSA's position is really key here, and it's different from all of the other groups, in that the status quo actually suits the UWSA quite well. And it has played a spoiler role in the NCA negotiations. It has quit the talks at various points over perceived protocol slights, but its interests are in furtherance of the conflict. And the United States still has sanctions on UWSA that are drug kingpin sanctions, so some of the only remaining U.S. sanctions on Myanmar dating from before 2016. And I think if the NCA is to progress under this government or a future government, the Wa State Army has to be a part of that solution. They have to be at the table, and there are external ways to force them to the table, but those haven't really been tried in earnest by Western partners up until this point.
And just one other thing to add on that, which I think you can see behind the non-signatories are split across several alliances. So I mentioned the Northern Alliance already. The UWSA, which Aaron was just alluding to there, is the main group in another alliance, which involves the 4 Northern Alliance members and 3 other groups called the Federal Political Negotiation and Consultative Committee. So all of the members of that alliance are also outside of the nationwide ceasefire agreement. So they have taken part in informal talks with the government, as have the Northern Alliance. But I very much agree with Aaron that the UWSA is a very important actor. The fact that it has 30,000 armed members and is in charge of its own self-administered zone. The Myanmar government and the military have for a long time known that it's not a good idea to go back on the peace with the UWSA and engage in conflict with it. And also I think the UWSA kind of serves as an example for the other armed groups of what they could possibly achieve if the peace process was to go well for them, to be in control of their own autonomous zone in their own region, where they represent their own ethnic minority groups.
Aaron, can you tell us a bit about the kind of regional dimension and maybe the role of China or others? Who is interested and who does what?
Sure. So I think the Chinese role and how it's developed over the last few years is really interesting. Sun Guoxiang, who's the Chinese peace envoy, has inserted himself into the peace process in a big way, and I think is probably, with the exception perhaps of Min Aung Hlaing himself, the most important person in the peace process. And so China effectively now has a veto. Beijing has a veto over any developments in the peace process. And Beijing's interests in Myanmar are diverse. Of course, there's large-scale investment in the China-Myanmar economic corridor, which was announced earlier this year. But there are also interests in the borderlands, and in some cases, China does not appear to be a coherent actor or a cohesive actor in Myanmar. Yunnanese interests are different from Beijing's interest, and so on. But China's role in the peace process, and also the way that it has sought to exclude other external actors from a similar role in the peace process is, I think, really interesting. So, for instance, Japan sought a major role in the peace process and had been funding the peace process under the previous government, and China was able to ensure that it did not receive the sort of stature that China has in the process. And this has, I think, prolonged the conflict. It's safe to say. China has actually delivered for the Myanmar government in terms of bringing some of these armed groups to negotiations at various points, but then those groups have either walked out of those negotiations or played a spoiler role, and there appears to be some coordination. I think it's probably an overstatement to say that the UWSA is a client army of China, as some have argued. It has its own interests, and they're certainly not always the same as Beijing's interests, but China's role in this process has not always been a constructive one.
Would you like to add anything? No.
Yeah, I think China has played a closer role in the peace process than any of Myanmar's other neighbours, and it perhaps has the biggest strategic interests in ensuring maybe not a peace settlement, but ensuring that stability to some degree is maintained in Myanmar. Obviously, as Aaron was just talking about, the Belt and Road Initiative, which everybody's heard a lot about in the last few years. Myanmar is becoming quite a key node in terms of China having access to the ocean through Myanmar, which would help circumvent navigation routes through the Strait of Malacca. So to have full access across Myanmar to those ports, I think China at the moment is involved in a railway project and oil and gas pipelines in Myanmar. So this is probably explains a major reason for its involvement as a convener, let's say, in the peace process. I don't think it would be enough to perhaps call China a mediator, but it's played an important role in convening meetings between the government and the Northern Alliance and the FNPCC, which are both not part of the nationwide ceasefire agreement, but China has attempted to bring the two sides to the negotiating table at times of heightened tensions. I guess in the idea that having some form of talks and communication channels open is better strategically for them than allowing things to just go on and the situation to deteriorate further.
I might just add one thing that I left out on the Rohingya side of things and China's role in that. So in 2017, the Chinese foreign minister intervened in the diplomatic negotiations between Bangladesh and Myanmar to try and get the two to strike an agreement over repatriation. That repatriation agreement hasn't gone anywhere because, again, Myanmar doesn't actually want it to go anywhere. It doesn't actually, its declared preferences, its demonstrated preferences are that it does not want Rohingya to return. But at the time, Beijing billed this as a major sort of humanitarian intervention. And at a time when the U.S., at the end of the Obama administration, was not really playing this role, I think it had a lot of success in sort of branding this as a successful humanitarian intervention. But the actual effect of the agreement was to make it appear as though Myanmar was willing to welcome back Rohingya to Rakhine State when again it's not. And so I don't actually think that was a particularly constructive contribution, and I'm not sure if it was that Beijing was naive in thinking that rapid repatriation would be possible, or if it was a sort of cynical move to curry favor with the Myanmar government and with Dhaka as well. But it hasn't been a particularly impactful contribution.
Thank you both for your insights. I will now invite questions from the floor. Please do state your name and affiliation before asking a question. Shall we take a few and then you pick your one?
No problem.
Yes, sir.
Khalid Nadeem, South Asian Middle East Forum. Thank you for your very pertinent presentations. I'm very concerned about the humanitarian situation. I believe in the West, sitting in London and sitting in Washington and Paris, we have a moral obligation to the Rohingya. This obligation has been abrogated by their own government. We have a problem at the moment. In London we have Brexit. In America we have President Trump is going on a retrenchment of engagement in international arenas. So this is a problem which I think has to be galvanized, led by the EU, France, Germany and the UK. And all of us have got to come together and tell this lady who's leading Burma, who we showered with awards, Nobel Prizes, honorary degrees from Oxford, that she was doing a great job and it was a great humanitarian, that in fact she's no longer a great humanitarian. We have got to do something about this because these people are dying, and it is so sad when I read the reports. It brings tears to your eyes. And we cannot leave it to China because China does not seem to have the capacity to understand the human rights situation. They have enough problems in Hong Kong to deal with without getting involved in Myanmar. So I think we need to send a message that we're going to take an active part and we're going to rescue these people, and we tell our governments in Paris, London, Washington, that something needs to be done.
Yeah, I think, I agree with many of the points you made in terms of the horrific nature of what's been going on in Rakhine State in recent years. And the 2017 crackdown was when the Rohingya situation and the persecution that they faced for many decades really broke out into the international media in such a way like it hadn't done before, despite there being previous crackdowns and mob violence in 2012, the previous smaller military crackdown in 2016. I think, as a general point, it does appear that Western powers and governments have less of an appetite for intervention on humanitarian grounds as they did in the 1990s when the conflicts were occurring in the Balkans. From my own perspective, I think repatriation is something which is very difficult to envisage that happening because many of the Rohingya simply don't want to go back, given the horrific brutality and crackdown they've experienced. Obviously the UK and the US are caught up with huge issues at the moment related to their own domestic politics, and the UK with its position in Europe. Whether multilateral leadership, perhaps led by the EU or ASEAN or other regional bodies, will materialise to put up a stronger rhetorical argument and stronger criticism explicitly of what's been going on, and whether they'll be able to do anything to make a real difference, I don't know. It's hard to imagine how they could change the situation on the ground, but stronger criticism, I think, would definitely be merited, given that we've seen stronger criticism of past episodes of abuses, some which say border on genocide, and ethnic cleansing, which are terms that have been used frequently by commentators and analysts to describe what's happened to the Rohingya. I don't know if Aaron wants to add something else on that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for your contributions. I think the West is doing quite a bit, and so I perhaps didn't give the U.S. as much credit as it deserves. When you look at the joint response plan for the Rohingya in Bangladesh this year, only about 54% of the requested amount has been raised thus far, and about 50% of that comes from the U.S., about $200 million. The U.S. has far and away the number one donor to the joint response plan. The UK has generally been in second. It's dropped down this year to fifth, although it's still sort of in the same ballpark as the EU, Japan, and Australia, which are all contributing around $30 million to the joint response plan this year. I feel a little bit like a telethon operator in saying that the opportunity for pledges are still open, but that was the latest numbers as of mid-October, so it could still change. But there's a little bit of a concentration risk, as investors might say. If there were sort of a macro shift on the Hill in the U.S. might contribute less to the joint response plan in future years, and that could create a humanitarian crisis. As it stands now, the JRP has only been funded in 2017 at about 72%, in 2018 about 69%. This year we're at about 54%, but again, there are a couple months left to go, so that could change. In terms of accountability, I think that's the most obvious way to address this. And accountability efforts thus far have focused on the military, which makes sense, given that it's the military that ordered the clearance operations in 2017. But there's clear coordination between the civilian government and the military. So I think it's likely that the civilian government has invited international criminal liability over time in the way that it's handled the situation. So there are a number of processes going on right now at the International Criminal Court. The prosecutor has opened an investigation into the deportation of the Rohingya, and the pretrial chamber actually authorized the prosecutor to look beyond just deportation and to look at crimes that could have led to deportation. That includes persecution, and it seems clear that the civilian government could be liable for persecution, for the crime of persecution under those guidelines. There's also a process going on at the ICJ, where the Gambia, on behalf of the OIC, has taken Myanmar to court under the Genocide Convention. That's a kind of experimental effort, but that could also lead to some sort of international legal condemnation. So there are opportunities to send a message to the Myanmar civilian government that the international community appears to be exploring. These move too slowly for the Rohingya. They say that they want to see accountability before they go back, and that's likely to be some years off.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm a student at SOAS, currently doing a master in politics of China. I lived in Myanmar before, and my question is about accountability for the civilian government. I think we failed to mention the Constitution. The Constitution gives the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, and Ministry of Border Affairs to the military. And we also failed to remember that Aung San Suu Kyi invited Kofi Annan for the recommendation of a kind back in 2018. And if I remember correctly, the recommendations were announced on the 25th of August, the very same day the attack took place on Rohingya. So, to my view, it seems to me that there's a clear separation between the civilian government and the military. And we should also remember that in case of national security problems, the power can be shifted back to Min Aung, which is the commander-in-chief. So are we really sure that Aung San Suu Kyi and the civilian government is truly responsible? Because if you're looking at those actions, like inviting Kofi Annan, it doesn't look that way to me.
Look, the military bears primary responsibility for what happened in 2017. but it's not a very clear division. And I think the statement that the Aung San Suu Kyi's spokesperson issued in January of this year is indicative of how the consultations between the military and Aung San Suu Kyi have invited liability on behalf of the civilian government. So it was Aung San Suu Kyi who ordered the crackdown on the Arakan army in January of this year. Reportedly, this is her spokesman speaking for her, because she didn't want the international community to claim that she was harder on Muslims than she was on Buddhists. And because there have been a number of war crimes or allegations of war crimes committed in that conflict, I think, again, the civilian government bears some liability for what's happened over the course of this year, which may result in charges in The Hague or something like that. I think there's been some misunderstanding in terms of what Min Aung Hlaing's rights are with regard to a national emergency. There has to be the Peace and Security Council has to be convened, and Aung San Suu Kyi hasn't convened the Peace and Security Council, so Min Aung Hlaing can't, although he does have a majority on that council, he can't launch a coup without that council, sort of a constitutional coup as it's often called, without that council meeting. And it has to be the president that accepts the recommendation of the council. And because Aung San Suu Kyi controls the president, there actually is no opportunity for the military to sort of conduct a constitutional coup. And she's been reluctant to call a meeting of that council specifically because she fears what the military might do with more isolated states of emergency, which the council can call without the president's approval. So I think it's not quite as black and white a division as it's often portrayed to be, and that's where that liability comes from. Do you want to add something on that, Mike?
I would really just echo Aaron's comments on the point in general. I think in the first year or so of the NLD government, there was a great hope that things would change in Myanmar, that the military would soften its stance on internal security issues. And we mustn't forget that it was a signature policy of the NLD-led government and the previous military government to attempt to resolve the conflicts in Myanmar. What I would say is that with regard to the Rohingya and Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, public opinion is far more opposed to them than any other ethnic group or ethnic armed organisation within Myanmar, which explains why the crackdown against the Rohingya was particularly brutal and large scale. For example, ARSA are not in an alliance, a formal alliance with any other armed group in the country. There's almost no conceivable circumstance where the government would seek to bring them into negotiations related to the NCA. So I think accountability must be spread across both the military and the civilian leaders. Aung San Suu Kyi wields perhaps more power in Myanmar than people thought she might do at the start of her administration. And as Aaron mentioned, the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi also directed the offensive, the crackdown against the Arakan army, which it labels as a terrorist group along with the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. Unfortunately, it happens that such is the hostility toward the Rohingya that many of the other armed groups and their supporters would count not only the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army as militants, but they would count all of the Rohingya and their supporters, and they would see them all. They would cast the same net over everybody, which obviously appears completely unfair and unjust. But unfortunately, that is the situation to a large degree, and that's why it's so difficult for the Rohingya to return and to want to return into such an environment.
I would just want to say I'm glad you raised the Annan Commission's report, which was a good report. It was nuanced, it was objective, it tried very hard to be fair, it talked to all communities, despite the restrictions that were placed on it, and did a pretty good job of that. But the government hasn't implemented most of the Annan Commission's recommendations. It says it's implemented 80 of 87, but those claims lack credibility. And its initial language after the Annan Commission report was issued in the aftermath of August 25th was that it was going to implement all of them. Some might take a little bit longer. It now says, Tong Tun, the National Security Advisor and Minister for Foreign Investment, says, well, we can't possibly implement all of them. Some of them are just too difficult. So it's sort of moving the goalposts over time. If the Myanmar government did actually implement the Annan Commission's report, including a pathway to citizenship for the Rohingya, then that actually would be a path towards solving the conflict, but as Michael suggests, politically in Myanmar, particularly in the election year that we have coming up, it's unlikely to be a vote winner.
Thanks. It's Joe Wilson from Department for International Development here in London. Just coming back to the point just made a second ago, you said that US is leading the joint response plan, the UK is fifth. So this year we've announced further 117 million for the 2019 joint response plan, which puts us in second place, just behind the US. And it takes our total to 226 million since the start of the crisis.
That's
just so the room is aware of that.
Yes, thank you for correcting my figures.
And just a quick question also about the role of ASEAN in the crisis. How do you see them working in Rakhine, and how do you kind of see their role in creating the conditions for possible future repatriations?
I think if you look at the last 4 ASEAN statements that have been issued since the summit in Manila last year, the chairman's statement that was issued at that time was the first statement on the Rohingya crisis. That was not a particularly constructive contribution on the part of ASEAN. It endorsed the repatriation process that Myanmar has created, which again is not likely to actually lead to repatriations. It could actually lead to massive human rights abuses on a massive scale. So that was not particularly constructive of ASEAN. And it also endorsed the Independent Commission of Inquiry that Aung San Suu Kyi has set up to investigate crimes against humanity. And the ICOE, as it's called, which is led by Rosario Manalo, who's a former Philippine diplomat, it's unlikely to lead to any form of accountability. Ambassador Manalo herself has said that they're not interested in pointing fingers. So this is not an institution that I think is likely to deliver any kind of substantial accountability. My understanding is over time, they've been told that they need to do a little bit more than they actually will need to point some fingers. But it's certainly not an independent investigation, despite the presence of 2 international members. And so ASEAN's endorsement of that process, although very on brand for ASEAN, wasn't a really terribly constructive contribution. It's unlikely to deliver accountability. But what's really interesting is the most recent chairman's statement that came out of ASEAN last week is very different from the previous 3. So the 2 after the Manila chairman's statement were very similar to that statement. This latest statement is interesting, and so ASEAN has committed to setting up an ad hoc team that will be, this wasn't in the statement, but I'm told it will be based in Myanmar, probably in Yangon. And it won't be run by the AHA Center, the ASEAN Humanitarian Assistance Center. It'll be run by the Political Security Directorate. That's a step in the right direction. That's an organization that is much more likely to provide useful advice back to ASEAN. I think one of the key problems with the AHA Center's early involvement, although they're dedicated civil servants who were trying to do their best in a difficult situation, is that they were not the right team to be managing that process, and their mandate was sort of counterproductive to the humanitarian concerns. But this hopefully is a step in the right direction. Certainly possible that the ASEAN Secretariat will screw it up, but I think with international community support and also pressure, it's possible that we'll see a move in the right direction. I'm very interested in Marty Nadalagawa's proposal, which is for the UN Security Council to invite ASEAN as a regional organization under, I think it's Rule 37 of the Security Council procedures, to update the Security Council on how it's doing in managing the situation in Rakhine. And it previously did this with the Pravahar dispute in Cambodia-Thailand border in 2011. So that might, although it would be presented as an opportunity for ASEAN to demonstrate leadership, it would also put pressure on ASEAN to get its act together and to come up with a more forward-leaning stance on the situation. So I think there are opportunities to engage ASEAN in constructive ways, and it's sort of up to the broader international community to make sure that happens. But thank you for the correction on the figures. I'm happy to hear that the UK is continuing to support the Joint Response Plan.
Yes, sir.
Sure, hi, and thanks for your presentations. My name is Lucian Harriman and I work with Safer World. A few questions. First, you mentioned that China has an effective veto on the peace process. I'd love if you could elaborate a bit more on how that has taken place to date or how that works in practice. Secondly, the West is there trying to engage in and support the peace process in Myanmar. The Joint Peace Fund comes to mind as the first sort of initiative, major initiative to seek to support it. What would be your characterization of Western attempts to support the peace process, and would you have any recommendations for maybe more effective approaches? And thirdly, it's widely acknowledged that most of the NCA signatories are minor groups, but I wouldn't characterise the Shan State Army South or the KNU as being minor groups. And they remain like significant political actors with arguably, with at least in the case of the Korean, a view to securing some kind of transformation of governance in the country. But I just wonder how you see how likely they are to remain patient with the current peace process, and how long, if you is there a risk you see fighting in Myanmar being characterised as ceasefires in one region while war in another, and then the Tatmadaw sort of relocating the ceasefires and relocating the fighting. The fighting is very severe in the southeast, like in the late 90s and early 2000s, when there were ceasefires in current areas of insecurity. So how likely do you see there to be a return to violence in those areas? And I guess that basically, so many questions, but I guess that basically relates to the viability of the NCA process as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I can tackle the last of those questions first regarding the southern conflict groups. And it is true to a certain extent that the Karen National Union and the two Shan State armies are more powerful and have more influence than some of the other groups which have signed the NCA. To this point, however, they've not clashed on a major scale with other armed groups or the government. I know the Shan groups have been involved in some clashes over the past year, and the KNU has, on many occasions in recent months, in the past 6 months, voiced its disapproval with the peace process. There's been many meetings of the peace process steering team, which is made up of the 10 NCA signatories, which the KNU hasn't attended, and its leaders have announced at various points that they intend to withdraw permanently from PPST meetings, and they've displayed a real outward reluctance to continue down the path of the NCA. I think in the last couple of months, the KNU has partially reversed that position, and it looks for the moment as if they're giving the NCA a chance to proceed with another conference rumoured to be set for early next year. Of course, nothing's been confirmed. It was the government who announced that was likely to happen. Whether it will do or not, it remains to be seen. But I have to say, I think the government takes the KNU and both of the Shan State armies more seriously than it takes the smaller groups in negotiations. The National Peace and Reconciliation Centre, which is the government's negotiating panel, has met on many occasions with the KNU and the Shan State armies separately, and plenty of these separate meetings happen with the other parties as well, both groups that have signed the NCA and that haven't. So yes, I think there is a risk of the peace process fracturing further. It would be a very bad sign if groups such as the KNU and the Shan State Army South decided to withdraw from the NCA. I think time will tell in terms of what happens next year in the build-up to the election. I think we have to remember it's an election year in Myanmar. It's scheduled for the end of next year, and in peace processes that we've seen across the region in the year leading up to an election, there's often very little progress made. Just thinking to the Southern Thailand peace process prior to their election this year, 3 or 4 months before the armed groups involved in negotiations in Thailand put things on hold, with various other frustrations and different internal dynamics going on also, which must be said, it wasn't just because of the election. But I think if we don't see a positive development in terms of the 4th Panglong Conference being held early next year, and in terms of more substantial discussions towards a bilateral ceasefire between the government and the Northern Alliance groups, if that doesn't happen early next year, then as we get closer and closer to the election, I think things are going to remain on hold, and the frustrations of armed groups are going to rise, much as they have been doing for the past 18 months. Whether that will result in more violence in the south, I think it's probably unlikely within the next year or so, given the smaller number of armed actors, armed fighters they're able to draw upon, and given the fact that they haven't fought for a number of years. I think we're far more likely to see further escalations in the northeast with the groups that have been most active in recent months, such as the TNLA, KIA, and their other allies. I think the fighting in Rakhine will continue at the present rate for the foreseeable future. There doesn't appear to be a sign of a breakthrough between the government and the Arakan army, even though they're involved in the Northern Alliance talks. I very much doubt even if a more substantial ceasefire was signed between those groups. And there has been unilateral ceasefires for different periods of this year, where the Northern Alliance have announced their own ceasefire, the Tatmadaw have announced their own ceasefire, which ended on the 21st of September. A Northern Alliance one is still in place, but clashes have continued and the ceasefires have been routinely broken. So over the next year, in the build-up to the election, unless there's a substantial peace breakthrough, I see it continuing in the same way.
Yeah, I'd just say on China, many of these groups are dependent upon China for access to funds, for access to weapons. This is not to say that the PLA is giving them weapons, but they access weapons through the Chinese hinterland, and they're dependent upon that hinterland, right? So when the MNDAA was basically beat in 2014, it retreated into the hills of Yunnan and then was able to come back. China has demonstrated an ability to prevent that, but it chose not to prevent that in that particular instance. This is not to say that China has complete control over the uplands, but it certainly is able to do more than it has done to date, and it seems to use that leverage at times when it's advantageous for Beijing. And then withdraws those forces when it's advantageous. I think the prospects for a nationwide peace agreement under this government, and I think we have to assume Aung San Suu Kyi will remain state councillor in the next government, are basically zero. I don't think that there is a prospect for the peace process as it is set up now to deliver a nationwide peace agreement. The most obvious example of this is the fighting with the Arakan army, which if the civilian government were to, say, drop the treason charges against Among and to restore some autonomy to Rakhine State, to say appoint a Rakhine chief minister, then I think there might be some prospect for peace talks between the Arakan army and Tatmadaw, but they're unlikely to do that. And I think at this point it may be too late. I think that Rakhine nationalism is there's so much support for the Arakan army in Rakhine State right now that even if they were to make some of these concessions, release Among, or appoint a Rakhine chief minister, it wouldn't necessarily dampen the support for Rakhine nationalism, for violent Rakhine nationalism. And so the prospects for peace, even in just Rakhine State, are quite slim. And I would just say, yes, the KNU and Shan State Army South are serious groups, but the KNU had a bilateral ceasefire in place well before the NCA was in place, and so it's not really evidence of the current process's ability to deliver results. Yeah.
One other thing, just to add, on the peace process, the nationwide ceasefire agreement at present is not a peace agreement as such. It's just a vague ceasefire. Yeah. In the text of the NCA, it does talk about the aspirations to forge a federal democratic union, and that is the desired outcome of the peace process via one means or another from both the government and the armed groups. However, with such a complex conflict situation, many different hotspots and battle zones within Myanmar, with their own localized characteristics, where a lack of trust has persisted for many decades between the armed groups, their supporters, and the military. There's continuing hostility. So like Aaron said, it's very, very difficult to envisage the NCA in its present form as a vague nationwide ceasefire agreement. It's very difficult to imagine that having a concrete impact in the coming years. There is some degree of hope that talks will progress to a more substantial level, but so far all every issue of substance with regard to the structure of future autonomous regions, the extent of devolved powers and control for armed groups, disarmament, demobilization and reintegration. It's all been put on hold, and it's been a stumbling block for the last 18 months. It would be hard enough to negotiate on those things if all 20 or 21 groups in Myanmar were brought on board. But when you have only 10 of them around the negotiating table, and you have the larger armed groups with tens of thousands of members, some of them, which are not a party to that process, it's very difficult to envisage how this peace agreement can succeed.
Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning a lot of the difficult issues that were meant to be in the NCAA were deferred into the political stage, and so the NCAA was only able to be completed because they set all the difficult issues aside for the next stage, which hasn't even begun yet because not everyone has signed the NCA. And I just mentioned, just to sort of lighten things up a little bit on the China angle, because this is, talking about Myanmar and conflict is always sort of unpleasant. But just going back to the China thing, Peng Jiasheng, the head of the MNDAA, was commanding the MNDAA assault in 2015 from a hotel room in Kunming. So, again, there are things that China could be doing to limit ethnic armed groups' access to funds, to resources, to that hinterland in China that it's not doing. There's another one. China Agricultural Bank had a crowdfunding account that was raising money for the MNDAA 2 years ago. So these are sort of, it's not as though all of this support is sort of covert and cloak and dagger. Some of it is very much out in the open. And that's the sort of thing that China could potentially shut down if it wanted to, but it seems to prefer to use as leverage.
Yes, Andre?
Yes, Andre Grisaro, intern at the Institute. Just to build on the previous question, given the lack of a nationwide peace agreement being able to be likely, do you believe that an alternative framework agreement can be implemented to move representatives of the government and of ethnic armed groups towards a substantial political discourse in order to build a sustainable and deep-rooted peace
I think it's a good question. I think the pathway towards bringing more groups into that category of groups which are able to engage seriously with the government is by signing separate bilateral ceasefires, whether that be between the government and individual armed groups or whether that be between the government and the alliances. And that has happened to a large extent over the decades of conflict which we've seen in Myanmar. However, often those ceasefires have also broken down. I mean, some have held for more than 30 years, for example, with the UWSA. It was 30 years earlier this year since that group stopped fighting on a regular basis with the government. However, there was a similar bilateral ceasefire with the Kachin Independence Army, which has about 10,000 fighters, which was signed in 1994. However, hostilities resumed in 2011, and there's been no sign of another agreement with the KIA since. So would it perhaps be a more plausible approach forwards? I mean, given the current divided nature of the process, it's certainly a more realistic outcome for the government to eventually come to a bilateral ceasefire with the Northern Alliance, to perhaps develop better relations with the UWSA and the groups in its 7-member alliance. And once it can satisfy those groups and they can come to their own agreements with the government, perhaps then they can be brought into some kind of nationwide discussion. I mean, in all likelihood, it will still be called the Nationwide Ceasefire Agreement, and that deal will still form the basis of what goes in the future. But that deal is really a precursor agreement, and future substantial discussions will need to go above and beyond what the NCA framework provides for if they're to be successful.
Dylan Hendrickson, Department of War Studies at King's College London. I mean, I'm just wondering whether the NCA is a problem or the government, and in particular the military, Tatmada's lack of commitment to political dialogue, because any framework which you have for political dialogue ultimately relies on actors being committed to real discussion. And I think one of the reasons that many of the groups have not signed the NCA is simply because they don't have any faith, based on past experience, that Tatmadaw is actually going to engage in a serious political dialogue. There have been 3 meetings since the NCA was signed in 2015, but there haven't been any substantive discussion on security issues and this whole dilemma of whether it should be DDR first or security sector reform first. And clearly some kind of middle path has to be found, and the government has completely avoided having any kind of comprehensive discussion on that issue. So I think, yes, the NCA has limitations, but I'm not certain that any other kind of framework agreement is going to make a difference until the military actually sees or accepts that there may be some benefit in engaging in a serious political dialogue and actually sort of compromising on some of the issues that are being put forward by the ethnic organizations.
I think feeding into that question, I mean, across 6 decades of conflicts, going on for 6 decades in many of the border areas, people's experiences and lack of trust and hostility between the Tatmadaw communities is often an overlooked factor when we talk about peace processes in all sorts of countries. It's fine for the leaders to come and have discussions and talk about things at the kind of elite, high up level where decisions can be made. On the ground, realities are often different. And for sure, people's experiences of the Tatmadaw and abuses, extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances, rape and sexual violence, it's been going on for many decades. So the lack of trust, which filters all the way through from the people at the very bottom, civilians impacted by violence in their communities, to the rebel groups and their leadership, and it is very, very hard for them to believe that the military will take their concerns seriously and that violence won't resume again. One accusation that's been levelled at the Tatmadaw on plenty of occasions since it introduced a unilateral ceasefire for most of this year, which ended in September, was that they were using the ceasefire as a kind of as a cover to reinforce troop numbers in some of the lesser active conflict zones in the northeast, around where groups such as the KIA and the TNLA are based. There were many reports of troop movements which were not meant to happen under the language used when they announced the ceasefire. So I think given the hostility and the lack of trust which persists, it's difficult for either side to trust each other. It's difficult for the armed groups to trust that the Tatmadaw will abide by any ceasefires and will be serious about giving them autonomy. And at the same time, the Tatmadaw is very wary when the armed groups put in place their own ceasefires. And it's a frequent occurrence that both sides blame each other for the outbreak of violence. It's always completely opposed narratives with every individual clash and incident that happens. You get a different story from the armed group involved, you get a different story from the military, different accounts of what happened, different accounts of casualty figures. It's a very difficult environment in terms of information to work in, I think.
Thank you. So with that, I draw the event to a close. Thank you for joining us today and asking interesting questions, and thank you to Michael and Aaron for sharing their insights on Myanmar today.